The UK rental market is on the verge of its biggest shake-up in decades. 40% of landlords are preparing to sell. So what happens when rental supply crashes? What will this mean for tenants, home buyers, and property investors? Because we're not just talking about a few landlords exiting. We're talking about a shift that could reshape the property market forever. I've spent over a decade in this industry working with investors, landlords, and institutional developers. And I can tell you, this is bigger than just some new rental laws. So in this video, I'll break down the 10 biggest factors driving landlords out of the market and why this could either be a crisis or the biggest opportunity for smart investors, homeowners, first-time buyers, and even tenants. But why should you listen to me? Well, since 2013, I've built a UK-wide home buying company, British Home Buyers, and a nationwide estate agency, British Home Sellers, that has handled over 14,000 property transactions, totaling over £4.2 billion. I've seen firsthand how government policies and economic shifts impact landlords, homeowners, and tenants. And trust me, this isn't just another policy change. Let's get into it. The 10 reasons landlords are leaving. Number one, the UK's landlord exodus started years ago. Many assume landlords started quitting in 2024, last year, due to all of these rental reforms. Wrong. This graph shows the amount of properties occupied by private renters since the year 2000. And you can see how the volume of buy-to-lets was growing exponentially until 2017, where it began to slow down. What happened? Well, it's simple, really. A range of anti-landlord measures have periodically been put in place, as you can see from this graph. We started with the 3% extra stamp duty, which has since now increased to 5%. We had the introduction of Section 24. Then we had the tenant fee ban that pushed more lettings costs onto landlords. Of course, interest rates began to rise. That's impacted everyone. And more recently, we now have the headwinds created by the Renters' Rights Bill working its way through the House of Lords at the moment, which promises to do a whole bunch of things I'll get into later in this video. From 2017 to 2023, the UK's lost 90,000 rental properties because landlords are selling more than landlords are buying up, despite the fact our population has risen by 2.3 million people. Over that time, the number of tenants in the UK has seen a significant increase. And no surprise, private rental prices have risen considerably. In 2024, last year, only 10% of homes sold were bought by landlords, the lowest figure since records began in 2010. So I hope this shows you that the exodus of landlords is nothing new. Rental supply has been shrinking for years, putting even more pressure on an already stretched market. So why have landlords been leaving? 2, mortgage rates have exploded. In 2022, mortgage rates were around 3%, with some landlords paying as low as 2%. Landlords were making better returns. By 2023, rates had jumped to over 6%, with some landlords paying 7-8%, even more. Higher mortgage rates equals shrinking profits, forcing many landlords to exit the market. So this is really what has caused such an increase in rents, because either landlords start losing money or they leave the market altogether, or you have to pass this cost on to tenants for the property business to remain viable. Remember, landlords are running a business and the property is the product. Ultimately, we've all suffered high interest rates, not just landlords, but all of us homeowners, anyone with debt to service. But high interest rates alone is just one of the things hurting landlords at the moment. What else is happening out there? 3, tax changes are hitting hard. Since 2016, tax reforms have made it much harder for individual landlords to turn a profit. The main tax change that hurts landlords up until now was the introduction of Section 24. So landlords who own properties in their own name, so not through a limited company, face higher tax bills than they did before. So this table gives you a good overview of the impact of Section 24 in practice. In short, mortgage interest can't be deducted as a cost pre-tax. Instead, you get a 20% tax credit on your mortgage cost. So from this example, whereas the taxable rental profit would have been £9,375, that taxable profit increases to £15,000 because Section 24 obligates you to include your mortgage cost as revenue, not as a cost. So if you're a 40% taxpayer, then you pay 40% on the £15,000, which totals £6,000. But you then get a 20% tax credit for 20% of your mortgage interest payments, which totals £1,125. But of course, even with that, your profit drops from £5,625 before Section 24 came in to £4,500 now, a 20% drop. If you're a 20% taxpayer, this Section 24 nonsense will not affect your tax bill. If you own property in a limited company, then Section 24 does not apply. So new landlords can structure their investments smartly, but older landlords are stuck with a system that makes property investments less attractive. Except there was a loophole investors are using that is set to close April this year. The way old landlords got around Section 24 was by converting their buy-to-lets into holiday lets. Holiday let income bypasses Section 24. However, post-April 2025, mortgage interest relief will be restricted to the basic rate of income tax, 20%, similar to the rules for standard buy-to-let properties owned as an individual. This means higher tax rate taxpayers will receive less relief, potentially increasing their tax liability. So you can see tax changes are changing the goalposts for landlords holding property in their own name. However, those holding property within limited companies aren't having these same sort of challenges yet. But let's look at a real life example of how this is impacting a typical landlord out there. For Landlord Mike's story, why he's selling up. Let me introduce you to Mike, a landlord who's been in the game since 2005. He bought 3 properties in the mid-2000s. His rental income covered his mortgage payments and gave him a solid monthly payment, and he was a great landlord to his tenants. But by 2023, his mortgage payments doubled. His tax bills kept rising, cutting into his profits. Now, with new regulations that I'll get into later, making evictions harder and rent increases more difficult to apply, he decided it's time to sell. And Mike isn't alone. Thousands of landlords are facing this same dilemma. And remember, this isn't hurting the big corporate landlords anywhere near as much as it's hurting the small family-run business landlords. It's interesting how the high street is now filled with Costas and Starbucks rather than those lovely local independent coffee shops. I wonder why. Could that same thing be happening to the rental market? What do you think? Is that a good thing or a bad thing for tenants? 5, the end of no-fault evictions. One of the biggest changes coming in 2025 is the Renters' Rights Bill, which, if passed, will include the abolishing of Section 21 no-fault evictions. Landlords won't be able to remove tenants unless they have a solid legal reason, like selling the property or serious rent arrears. There will be no such thing as fixed term tenancies, as when these changes come into effect, all tenancies will convert to rolling contracts. You'll need to give 4 months notice up from the current 2 months notice to get your property back as a landlord. The eviction process will be longer and more complex, as if a tenant stops paying rent, you'll have to wait 3 months rent arrears up from the current 2 months before you can even start eviction proceedings. So this is forcing many landlords to rethink their portfolios, as if you're a corporate landlord with thousands of tenants, you can absorb a small percentage defaulting without ruining the portfolio's cash flow. But if you're a small landlord with maybe a handful of properties, if just 1 or 2 tenants stop paying because you're unlucky and you can't evict them easily, that could be enough to completely ruin a landlord's cash flow. It could wipe out their business. If you're in that position as a landlord, make sure to get landlord rental insurance or look into it, because it can cover against that risk. But it's not just no-fault evictions making landlords quit. 6, rent increases can be blocked by tenants. Under the Renters' Rights Bill, tenants can challenge rent increases by taking landlords to a tribunal. This process could delay rent increases for months, making it harder for landlords to adjust rising costs. It's creating bureaucracy from nowhere. With mortgage rates, insurance, and taxes rising, many landlords can't afford this uncertainty. The details of this haven't been ironed out yet, but my hope is this is actioned sensibly. So if a tenant challenges the rent increase and the tribunal confirms the increase was fair, then the tenant should pay the increase backdated and cover the tribunal costs. If the tenant challenges the rent increase and the tribunal confirms the increase wasn't fair, then the landlord should pay the tribunal costs and pay some sort of penalty to the tenant. Perhaps it could be a month's rent, for instance, so the tenant gets a month rent free. Ultimately, there has to be an incentive for neither party, landlord or tenant, to take advantage. What do you think about my suggestion? I think it's pretty reasonable, which is probably why it won't happen. 7, institutional landlords are taking over. The silent winner in all of this and all these changes are institutional landlords, those big corporate landlords. The build to rent sector is booming at the moment. In 2023, £4.5 billion was invested in corporate rental properties. And these institutional landlords aren't big local businesses in your area. They're often not even big UK-based businesses. US giants like Goldman Sachs are pouring billions into UK property to capitalise on the reduced supply of rental properties and the increased demand for them. Big banks like Lloyds are building their own rental portfolios and competing directly with private landlords. You can see from this article in 2021, they plan to buy 10,000 homes by the end of 2025 this year. How are they doing against that? Well, as of recently, as of November, they crossed just over 5,000 homes. So they're clearly still buying, and they're one of loads of big corporates doing this. This is a classic case of a corporate takeover. While small landlords face new restrictions, big investors are taking market share. The wealth is filtering to the top. You tell me, do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing for tenants? I'm interested. And also, a favour, please press the subscribe button if you haven't already. It really helps me out. 8, the stamp duty squeeze. From April 2025, the zero rate stamp duty threshold drops from £250,000 to £125,000. For first time buyers, the relief is cut from £425,000 to £300,000. So expect a flurry of buying in Q1, followed by a sharp slowdown in Q2. And why do I think this? It's what's happened every other time stamp duty rates have changed over the last decade, as you can see from this graph. This is ultimately the end of a temporary tax drop Conservatives brought in. So this tax rise is ultimately going to make it harder for landlords to expand the portfolios and in fact anyone buying properties. Let's not forget the second home stamp duty has already risen from 3% to 5%. And also let's not forget that bigger landlords like corporates buying 6 or more properties at a time qualify for paying non-residential stamp duty rates. I don't know why. I don't even know why this exists. It's absurd. So not only does this skip them paying the 5% second home surcharge, but the overall stamp duty rates are far, far lower than what you or I would pay if we're buying our next home. So think for a moment how much Lloyds Bank saved in stamp duty when buying those 84 homes back in November in that article. It's mad, isn't it? You just can't make this stuff up. How are they getting tax breaks? On that note, I do have a video on this channel that runs through 8 legal ways to avoid stamp duty that you should check out if it interests you. 9 government policies keep changing the rules. This, to me, is the big issue. Constant regulatory changes make property investment more unpredictable. Many landlords feel like they're being targeted, while big institutions are getting tax breaks. Uncertainty is making long-term property investment riskier to your day-to-day property investor. So for instance, at the moment, so many landlords are leaving the market due to the Renters' Rights Bill, which isn't even law yet. It could change for the better or for the worse. It may never even happen, although I personally think some form of it will come to pass. But many landlords are selling up purely due to this uncertainty, the stress it creates. This all creates uncertainty for the future. And finally, 10, the market is changing, but not all landlords will lose. Here's the important takeaway I hope you get from this. While some landlords are quitting, others are buying up properties they leave behind. I'm seeing this happen every day. Generally, it's the bigger landlords buying up and the smaller landlords scaling down. If landlords keep selling up, supply shrinks. Demand, of course, is still rising and rents will keep climbing. Smart investors who adapt to these new rules will dominate the market in years ahead because there'll be less competition. Corporate landlords aren't backing out for this reason. They're doubling down. So is this really the end for landlords, or is it just a shift in who owns the properties we live in? Let me know in the comments. Are you holding on to your properties, or do you think now is the time to exit altogether, or are you investing? I'll see you in the next video up here.